Hello, today we're going to do something slightly different from normal, again I guess, given that the last video was slightly different from normal, but anyone who's a patron of mine will know that for a long time I've been doing book reviews for patrons, and I'm going to continue doing book reviews for patrons, but I have like a big backlog of them, so I thought that it might be worth sharing them on YouTube. You know, if you want to get the more up-to-date ones, you can always subscribe to Patreon, and where I'll be continuing to do one, and the one that I will be doing next will be on a book on neoliberalism and the family that was recommended to me a while ago by Abby Thorne, and that I am finally getting round to actually reading. But this week's, this sort of months, maybe I'll do them once or twice a month, depending on, you know, how much time I've got. This time I'm going to do a book by one of the most well-known Marxist communicators, Richard Wolff. And, you know, this is going to be quite a critical book review, which is not to say that I'm trying to cancel Richard Wolff, but as one of the most well-known Marxist communicators around, and he's a very good communicator.
You know, if you grow up in the United States, you hear often from employers or people who have been bamboozled by them that, gee, the employer takes a risk. He deserves some extra, some profit, because he took a risk. I always found this extraordinary. He did take a risk, but so did everybody else, you idiot. You got rid of kings and queens and monarchy because it was unbearable to have some jerk whose achievement was to be the son of the previous jerk and was telling you what to do all the time, and you had to take your hat off when he passed in his coach, and he referred to you as his subject. We killed those people. We cut their heads off. And we go to work every day where there is a king who tells you what to do, and you better take your hat off. Oh, you're fired.
I think we need to hold him to a high standard. So this week's book review is going to be on a book called Class Theory and History, Capitalism and Communism in the USSR by Stephen Resnick and one Richard D. Wolff. So for about a century now, there have been debates and arguments on the left about precisely what mode of production characterized the USSR. You know, was it truly communist? Was it state capitalist? Or was it a deformed workers' state? You know, and as one of the most well-known and popular Marxist communicators, Richard Wolff and his collaborator Stephen Resnick think they have an answer. For them, the USSR should be truly understood as a state capitalist system, but not for the ways in which all others before them have understood it. For Wolff and Resnick, all prior views of the USSR as state capitalist have eliminated the economic in favour of an understanding which rests on bureaucratisation and consolidation of power. That is, for Wolff and Resnick, no one has been concerned with who appropriates the, quote, surplus produced by workers in the Soviet Union. In contrast to prevailing views, Wolff and Resnick argue that the USSR is state capitalist precisely and only because it is the state and not the workers who appropriate and control the surplus produced by those workers. Anything beyond that doesn't speak, to them, doesn't speak to the nature or existence of capitalism. And I don't want to use this review to get into a debate about the precise nature of the USSR. No, the reason I read this book is because my knowledge of its context is not ideal. My history knowledge is not great. My theory, that's pretty tight. My theory is pretty tight, which is why we're getting into it today. Because instead of the history, I want to talk about how Wolff and Resnick have built their entire theoretical framework on a totally incorrect understanding of the most fundamental, the most very basic of Marxian terms.
What?
You know, I was shocked reading this, just how absurdly Marxist concepts are used by the authors, especially when Wolff is one of the most well-known communicators, one of the most well-known Marxists around. Very, you know, he's often used to introduce people to Marxism. So can we introduce people to Marxism when we're using terms incorrectly? You know, when we build our introduction on just fucking quicksand. I was reading this, I was asking myself, how can he misunderstand, deliberately or not, these fundamental building blocks of Marxism so completely? So let's begin not with a specific concept, but with the way in which Wolff and Resnick seem to cast aside the notion that capitalism is a total or totalizing social system, which is a notion central to Marx. And instead, they rely on a highly abstracted notion of what capitalism entails, alongside a totally siloed sociological understanding of different parts of society. Wolff and Resnick's view of capitalism rests entirely on one thing, that producers and appropriators of, quote, surplus are different groups. And keep this word surplus in mind for later. Now, while it's hardly argued explicitly in the book, we have to assume that these different groups under capitalism are formally free and mediated by market relations, and that they're largely coerced by market power, rather than political power. Otherwise, this narrow view of class relations could be easily understood as applying to feudalism, where producers and appropriators of surplus are different classes, lord and serf. Unfortunately, however, if we do expand the view of class relations of production like this, it kind of undermines Resnick and Wolff's whole point that Soviet class relations were necessarily capitalist, given that the market wasn't always involved and political, not economic coercion often was. And this isn't my perspective on that, that's the story that they paint in the book. So it's internally inconsistent with what they write. So we can see already that the theoretical basis of this book is so shaky that even the threads of this review can become really easily tangled up. But let's keep the assumption of capitalist class relations being slightly expanded beyond what Resnick and Wolff explicitly state, just to try and make some sense of things. Even with this expansion, siloing off class within only this kind of social relation is an exercise in intellectual abstraction, which is frankly counter to the entire project of Marxism. So when we talk about abstraction in this way, what we mean is taking the messy reality, simplifying it and placing it above or outside of concrete reality. Marx engages in abstractions all the time. In Capital, for example, he begins with the assumption of a perfectly functioning capitalist society and a world market system. This is not, as some Marxists, and especially like the political Marxists, like people like Ellen Meskin Woods, seem to believe, to reveal a fundamental singular capitalist logic, a pure capitalism, but rather, as Marx does throughout the 3 volumes of Capital, this abstraction is supposed to introduce further, it's supposed to prompt us to introduce further complexity to this social totality of capitalist society. So you can see a good example of this when we turn to something I talk about a lot, which is social reproduction. So, for example, when we illustrate a highly abstract class relation of employee-employer, imply that this is the one class relation. This class relation necessarily implies the reproduction of both groups, because you can't have that employer-employee relationship for very long if those two groups aren't reproduced. That is, this relation, employee-employer, necessarily implies a whole host of other reproductive class relations, such as daily household and generational reproduction of the workforce. This is just one of the reasons why Wolff and Resnick's insistence that capitalism is only the employer-employee relation is completely untenable. While Marx famously leaves gender divisions under-theorized, feminist and social reproduction theorists have really effectively demonstrated how gender relations in the home are class relations. This exercise in intellectual abstraction, which traces a class relation of producer and appropriator, necessarily implies unwaged reproduction. And similarly, after establishing an abstracted relation between producers and appropriators, Marx famously introduces racial disparities within that logic between English and Irish workers as illustrative of class and race differences. This is what Michael Lebowitz calls capitalism's X factor. So race is considered within this a class relation, one that alters the fundamental logic of capital. And as Stuart Hall points out in his really excellent essay, Notes on Marx's Methods, which I recommend everyone reads because it's one of the best explanations of how Marx's method actually works. Stuart Hall points out that the original abstraction, this original intellectual abstraction of employer and employer, of whatever, it functions to invite us to probe further things, to investigate further questions, to investigate why, how these labourers, how these workers are reproduced. It's not that this is the logic, it's that this logic which has been produced necessarily implies a whole host of other things, which aren't external to capitalism, but are very much part of it. And, another theorist who speaks to this sort of thing is Soren Mao, and he speaks about how race, because of this implication, is inherent to the logic of capital. But he sort of falls down by arguing that that nothing in the abstraction of employee-employer relationship necessarily implies that the reproduction of labourers are gendered. And the problem with Mao's argument is that in trying to find a singular logic of capital, Mao ends up abstracting too far away from this concrete historical reality that reproductive labour is gendered and is patriarchal, and doesn't allow that concrete reality to reflexively impact the abstract logic of capital, rather than excluding that reality from the model. Excluding realities from models is much more in the wheelhouse of orthodox economics, not Marxism. Not good Marxism.
Just to be clear, Mao isn't one of those bad Marxists. His book Compulsion is very good, and I'd encourage you to read it. It just, I just think it has some limitations.
But importantly, none of this is accountable under Wolff and Resnick's narrow theorizing. Class for them is only the relation between labourer and appropriator. All else is explicitly referred to as non-class, additionally determining relations. Throughout the book, they refer to household relations not as capitalist, but as ancient or feudal, even when they track a restructuring of Soviet household relations where women are encouraged to engage in both productive and household labour, which is, a condition which, seems somewhat similar to alterations in Western labour markets since, the mid-20th century. But for Wolff and Resnick, these restructurings cannot be indicative of a capitalist gender-class relation to, lower the reproductive cost of labour power on the market, because gender is not accountable within a class relation. Class relation is only employee-employer. So these alterations have to just be a return to non-capitalist, ancient or feudal gender relations. Any implication that wage labourers require unwaged social reproduction is cast entirely outside the class relations of society. So what we end up getting is not like a complex social totality in which different class relations are altered and alter each other internally to the functioning of that social whole, but several different siloed off realms of society which externally overdetermine, in the author's words, social agents. Patriarchy is non-class. It's not constitutive of capitalism. Race is non-class. It's not constitutive of capitalism. Or so the story goes. But why propose such a theoretical tunnel? Like, the authors do recognise that these so-called non-capitalist parts of society are important, but they're not part of capitalism? Why? Well, what I think has happened is that in Wolff and Resnick's quest to redefine Marxist concepts to promote a political vision, a political proposition of market socialism, they have been forced to artificially separate these social worlds. And this brings us to perhaps the most baffling theoretical innovation in this book: communist class and communist surplus value.
What?
Concepts which had me almost put down the book when I came across them. So while Wolff and Resnick identify capitalist class structures as producers and appropriators of surplus value being different people, they create an idea that communist class is defined by those two groups being the same. That is, co-ops are communist, apparently. For Richard Wolff, and Stephen Resnick then, communist society doesn't have to be classless and moneyless. And indeed, there are different classes in their view in communist society, where those not involved in direct production of surplus, which must mean commodities, production of commodities, as we'll talk about later, those people who are not involved in production are of a separate class. And as an aside, under this theory, anyone who works a service job or for the state in a non-productive capacity, so, bin men, teachers, nurses, is not working class. And the problem is, this is nonsense. This is not a concept in Marx's work, nor is it something that we can easily or something that makes sense to derive from Marx's work. Marx famously describes a communist society as one in which class and money disappear, allowing for total human flourishing. And they know it. Wolff and Resnick know this because they discuss it slightly in the book and then cast it aside as something that will maybe happen later. So instead what they've done, they seem to be aware of this work in Marx, because I believe that they've read this work carefully. But in service of this sort of political ideal of market socialism, they've performed surgery on this social whole, removed one aspect of class and presented it as a representation of an entirely new society. But this becomes even more confusing once we consider that, according to this view, communist class can exist alongside capitalist class. That is, these communist co-ops produce communist commodities with communist surplus labour and communist value. None of these concepts are in the Bible. They don't make sense. They rest on a mashing of the concept of value found within Marx. For Marx, value appears in different ways. Use value and exchange value. Under capitalism, commodities hold both. The surplus that workers produce when they produce commodities under capitalism is not surplus food as in feudalism, but surplus value beyond the wage that is paid for their labour power. So what we see is an abstraction in a different sense than we used earlier. This is a real abstraction, a violent abstraction, whereby labour becomes abstract labour, no longer human, but like a cog in a machine. So we can regularise wages and labour costs across entire economies. This is essential to commodity production. You cannot produce commodities for a commodity market, a capitalist market, without forcibly abstracting labour in this way and exploiting people, even if you work in a co-op. This is why Marx conceives of communism as the abolition of the commodity form, and not, as Wolff and Resnick do, as worker co-ops. And Marx understands the limits of worker co-ops as a revolutionary tool because of these things. So when Wolff and Resnick refer to communist surplus throughout this book, it is an incoherent idea. We cannot be talking about only, communist farms producing surplus food that's then redistributed. That would be too narrow to what they're understanding their sort of goal to be in their theory. We have to be talking about surplus value beyond that which is needed to reproduce the worker via wages, held within commodities produced by abstracted labour so that they can be exchanged on a marketplace for enough profit to reproduce the production process for another round. What they've done is recreate capitalism, but with co-ops. And this is the crux of the issue with Wolff and Resnick. This entire 400-page book, this magnum opus examination of the USSR and its class structure, is built on a totally incoherent interpretation of Marx, an interpretation which is in service to a political commitment to market socialism. For market socialism to be legitimate, these Marxian categories have to be murdered, cobbled back together and zapped back to life in a mockery of what they once were. So, while I've not scratched the surface of the total misinterpretations of Marx's work in this book, I can say we've learned maybe two things. Two things throughout this review. One, Wolff and Resnick cannot offer a cogent analysis of class in the USSR. And two, market socialism is fake. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this review. If it does well, if people respond to it and people like it, I'll keep doing them. I'm going to keep doing my Patreon book reviews. Like I said, I'm going to keep doing them early for patrons, so if you want to read that other work, get the latest, then please sign up to my Patreon. And if you can't afford to do that, or anything else, or you don't want to, consider giving a one-off tip via PayPal or Ko-fi. That'd be much appreciated. Patrons get their $10 and up patrons get their names read out in the credits, and I will do that off camera when I look up their names. Yeah, this book broke me in some ways. It was strange. It was a strange book. I think we need to be better at understanding basic Marxian terms. See you another time.
Demo Squid, Dying of Thirst, Soval Hayes, Earl Grey Tea, Bonnie, Kate Marshall, Nina G Public Relations, FD Signifier, Quint Wolff, Kim Crawley, Anita Anispe, Ellis Wren, S, Hey Joe, Cameron Blakemore, Ms Ling, Lawrence Rowland, Cyril Smid, Rachel Ann, Melanie Estes, Leum, Xander Corvus, Fia Westfall, Jack, TV Skyen, Christopher Poff, Morgussie, Daniel Cusid, Joshua Moldenhauer, Tom Price, Cade Soiree, Esoteric Fictionalism, Austin Talman, Robin, Rachel Nixon, Rich, Duncan Skinner, Neil Zabelgard, Tinfoil Pancakes, Kieran Gore, Aga Ghost, Barney Carroll, Joel, Daniel Hughes, Nelly Zacheva, J. Fraser Cartwright, Aaron, Damish Kispiter, and Paul Singleton. Alright, thanks for watching again, and bye, love you.